Did you know K2 is more dangerous than even Mount Everest? K2 is often called the Savage Mountain. It's a place where even the most seasoned climbers face relentless storms, steep and icy slopes, and a chilling reality. There is no margin for error. Unlike Everest, where thousands have attempted and many have succeeded, K2 remains a far more dangerous and deadly challenge. Here, on these treacherous ridges and snowfields, some of the bravest women climbers in history met their untimely and tragic ends. They climbed with dreams and determination, but their fates were sealed by forces beyond their control. Hurricanes of snow, avalanches, and sudden slips into the void. On Everest, roughly 1 in 16 climbers don't make it out alive. But on K2, that number jumps to 4 in 16. 25% of climbers don't survive. Not great odds. And for the women on our list today, a collection of horrible fates. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Let's say you're standing on the top of the second highest mountain in the world. You've just climbed 28,251 feet, higher than almost any other point on Earth. Your lungs are screaming for air and you feel the sharp sting of the freezing wind on your face. But none of that matters right now, because you did it. You made it. That was the feeling Liliane Barrard had on June 21st, 1986. She stood there, right at the top of K2, with her husband, Maurice. The wind howled, and the snow was everywhere. But at that moment, nothing else mattered. They were there together on top of the world. But on K2, getting to the top is just half the journey. The real test is getting back down. As Liliane and Maurice began to climb down, the weather started to turn. At first, it was just a few clouds. Then, a biting wind began to pick up. Within hours, a full-blown storm hit. Imagine snow so thick you can barely see your hand in front of your face, the wind ripping at you and making every step a battle. In a blizzard on K2, the temperature drops fast, and everything feels like it's moving in slow motion. That's where Liliane and Maurice found themselves, trapped in a snowstorm high up on one of the deadliest mountains on Earth. They knew they needed shelter, and fast, so they found a narrow ledge and huddled together, trying to keep warm as the storm raged on. But as the hours passed slowly, each moment became colder than the last. They could feel their strength fading while their bodies were fighting just to stay warm. Liliane knew the danger. She knew the mountain didn't care who you were or what you had already survived. The mountain had taken many lives before, and now it was coming for them. The storm kept going all night. So by morning they were still trapped, exhausted, and freezing. They tried to move again, but the cold was too much. Liliane's body was shutting down. She could barely lift her feet. The wind was a relentless wrestler, battering them from all sides and forcing them back with every step, until at some point Liliane had to fall. She went down hard, snow covering her in seconds. Even though Maurice was right there, the blinding storm separated them. She tried to call out, but her voice was lost in the roar of the wind. She tried to get up, but her body wouldn't respond. Imagine lying there, feeling the cold creeping deeper into your bones, knowing you might not make it out. Who knows what she was thinking? What we do know is that, in her final moments, she was alone, with nothing but the wind and snow around her. When the storm finally cleared, rescuers found Liliane's cold and frozen body on a narrow ledge, just where she had fallen. But Maurice, her husband, was missing. Days turned into weeks, but there was no sign of him. Rescuers could only wonder how far the storm had pushed him. It would take 12 years before his body was finally discovered much further down the mountain than anyone expected. Like his wife, K2 had shown him no mercy. Liliane Barrard was one of the few women ever to reach the summit of K2, but the mountain took her life before she could make it back down. I wish her story was rare, but it's just one of many examples that show just how unforgiving K2 can be. Our next story is even more depressing. It's about the sad case of Julie Tullis, a filmmaker, a mother, and a climber who never backed down from a challenge. Unlike most climbers we talk about, Julie wasn't always a mountaineer. In fact, she didn't discover her love for climbing until her 40s. Before that, she was a judo instructor. But once she found climbing, she was hooked. It became her passion, her way to connect with the world. She even filmed her climbs, capturing the beauty and danger of the highest peaks. Before taking on K2, Julie had already climbed some of the toughest mountains on the planet, like Nanga Parbat and Broad Peak, which are both over 26,000 feet. And she did it while filming, which meant carrying her heavy camera gear along with her climbing equipment. She wanted to show the world what it was like up there, in the thin air, where every step was a battle. But K2 was different. The savage mountain was the ultimate test. It could make or break a climber's spirit, and Julie believed she was ready for it. In August 1986, Julie and her climbing partner, Kurt Diemberger, joined a small group attempting to climb K2. By then, both Julie and Kurt were experienced climbers, well prepared for the challenge ahead. The climb started well, and on August 4th they stood on the summit, over 28,000 feet above sea level. For a moment, it felt like they had won. But as you already know, the summit is only halfway. The real challenge is getting back down. And that's when everything began to fall apart. As Julie and Kurt began to descend, the weather turned quickly. A storm moved in, with winds blasting at over 60 miles per hour and snow coming down so heavily it felt like they were being buried alive. They managed to make it back to Camp 4, and this is where this story gets dark. Camp 4 is one of the highest camps on the mountain. It sits at around 26,000 feet, in what climbers call the death zone. It's called that because here, the air is so thin that there's only about a third of the oxygen available at sea level. That's why your body slowly begins to shut down, starving for oxygen. You can't eat, you can't sleep, and thinking clearly becomes almost impossible. Julie started to feel it. The first signs of altitude sickness hit her hard. For those who don't know, altitude sickness is a condition caused by not breathing enough oxygen due to the altitude. It's like having the worst headache of your life. You feel dizzy, your stomach is in knots, and you're too weak to even move. But it doesn't stop there. Your brain starts to swell from the lack of oxygen, and your lungs fill with fluid. Every breath becomes a struggle, like you're suffocating slowly. Julie was no stranger to the symptoms. She had felt them before and knew how to handle them, but never like that. That time was different and worse. And then it got even worse. While stepping outside the tent in the blizzard, Julie lost her footing on the icy slope, fell hard on the ice and broke her ribs. Kurt helped her back into the tent and dragged her back inside. But Julie was in bad shape and pain. They were trapped and the storm showed no signs of stopping. For days they stayed in that tent, huddled together against the cold, waiting for the storm to end. But K2 had them in its grip. There was no way out. Julie was fading fast. She could barely sit up, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The altitude sickness was getting worse, taking its toll on her body. Kurt tried to keep her awake, talking to her, urging her to hold on, but she was slipping in and out of consciousness. Her lips turned blue and her skin turned pale. She was freezing from the inside out. By August 7th, it was clear Julie wouldn't last much longer. She was too weak, her body too far gone. Kurt, her partner, said she looked up with eyes that said everything. She whispered that she was tired and needed to rest. Then, in the middle of the storm, she closed her eyes for the last time. Kurt stayed with her body, trapped by the storm. Days later, when the storm finally broke, the survivors began their long descent. Julie's body added an extra weight to carry down along with their equipment and oxygen. They had to leave her behind, high up on the icy slopes. It was a sad end to a bright, hopeful journey. Julie's death shocked many. She was a climber, storyteller, pioneer, and mother who followed her dreams to the very end. She understood the risks. She took every precaution. However, on K2, it doesn't matter how experienced or prepared you are. In a split second, an expert can turn into a helpless victim. And sometimes the tragedies on K2 don't show up as sudden storms or deadly falls. Sometimes the silent dangers, the ones you never see coming, claim the lives of even the most prepared. And the adventurer in our next story found out about this in the most heartbreaking way. In July 2008, Cecilie Skog stood on K2 with the calm confidence you'd expect from someone who had already conquered the highest and coldest places on Earth. Cecilie had climbed Everest, Denali, and Cho Oyu. So she wasn't new to danger or extreme conditions. She had skied to both the North and South Poles and was the first woman to achieve the Explorer's Grand Slam. She was a seasoned adventurer. She was ready for anything, or so she thought. Her husband was by her side, Rolf Bay, a fellow mountaineer who shared the same passion. They had climbed many peaks together, but K2 held a special place in their hearts. This wasn't their first time facing K2's unforgiving slopes. Back in 2005, bad weather had forced them to turn back. But now, 3 years later, they were determined to reach the summit. Together. They chose to climb K2 up the Sesson route because it had a direct path up the mountain's southern face. This route was more challenging than usual, but that's what made it appealing to them. The ascent went well. They made their way up the mountain in record time, and on August 1st, Cecile and her husband were almost on top of the mountain. The weather was clear, and everything seemed to be on their side when they began their final summit push. Rolf, who was a bit tired and suffering from altitude sickness, decided to hang back and rest just below the summit. But Cecilia and another climber, Lars Nessa, pushed ahead, driven by the dream of making history. Cecilia and Lars reached the top in the late afternoon of August 1st, 2008. It was a historic achievement for them both. With this climb, they became the first Norwegians to ever climb K2 successfully. But they didn't stay long. They knew the rules of the mountain. They had to get back down as soon as they could. The light started to fade, and they had to move. Rolf, who was still exhausted from the climb, lit up with a smile when he saw them. He was happy for their success. Lars offered Rolf the lead on the way down, but he refused. So as they descended, Lars went first with Rolf and then Cecilia following behind. They began their descent that same evening, their headlamps cutting through the growing darkness. As their headlamps cut through the darkness, they moved carefully down the steep, icy slopes. As experienced climbers, they knew a single mistake could be fatal here. But this was K2. On these slopes, sometimes being careful still isn't enough. As they continued to descend, a deep rumble suddenly echoed through the mountain. The ground beneath Cecilia's feet shook violently. Cecilia stumbled, trying to keep her balance. She looked up just in time to see a light flicker and vanish. Cecilia could only watch in horror as her husband, Rolf, was hit by the falling ice. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone, swallowed by the mountain. Cecilia called out to Rolf, her voice straining against the thin air and roaring wind. But there was no answer, only silence. Lars rushed ahead, desperately searching the darkness for any sign of him, while Cecilia stood frozen in shock and disbelief. She desperately hoped he was safe. Minutes felt like hours, but when Lars finally called back, his voice was shaky as he said the words she never wanted to hear. "Rolf is gone." We can only imagine the panic and the heartbreak, but there was no time to grieve. Cecilia had to keep moving. The fixed ropes they had used to ascend were either buried or destroyed from the effect. The route they had carefully navigated up was wiped away in a second. She was stranded at over 26,000 feet in the death zone, with no clear way down. She forced herself to take one step then another. She carried the shock and fear with her as she focused on just one thing: surviving the descent. The hours passed slowly and painfully as Cecilia climbed down K2. Her strength was fading. The thin air made it harder to breathe, and her body ached with exhaustion. But she couldn't stop. She knew if she didn't keep moving, she wouldn't make it out alive. So she clung to the mountain, moving down step by step in the dark, knowing one wrong move could be her last. Even though she thought she wouldn't make it, she kept going. Eventually, she reached Camp 4, exhausted but alive. Her husband and 10 other climbers had died on K2 that day due to the icefall. It remains one of the deadliest days in the mountain's history. By the time Cecilia finally made it back to base camp, She had been through hell. She had made history and somehow survived the savage mountain. But the cost was too heavy. She had come to K2 to climb with her husband and left with nothing but nightmare memories and heartbreak. Cecilia's story is not the only one shaped by K2's unforgiving nature. For some climbers, the call of the mountain is stronger than the fear of loss. The next story shows us just that. Alison Hargreaves answered the mountain's call, and this is her story. So picture this. It's the summer of 1995, and you're standing at the base of K2, staring up at its towering slopes. The sky is clear, the air is thin, and you know you're about to face one of the toughest challenges of your life. That's where Alison Hargreaves stood, a 33-year-old British climber and mother of two. But she wasn't just there to reach the top. She was here to make history. Alison wasn't just any climber. Even among mountaineers, she was in a class of her own. Not just because earlier that year, she made headlines worldwide when she became the first woman to summit Mount Everest solo without using bottled oxygen. Also because she conquered the Eiger North Face in winter while 6 months pregnant. She was driven, passionate, and fiercely independent. She was a climber who believed in doing things the hard way. So when she stood at the base of K2, her goal wasn't just to have a successful climb. She planned to make history again. This time by climbing the deadliest mountain on Earth the hard way. No oxygen, no high-altitude porters, and no compromises. In June 1995, Alison arrived at the base of K2, ready to take on the mountain through the Abruzzi Spur. This route, named after the Duke of Abruzzi who attempted it in 1909, is one of the most popular but also one of the most technically challenging paths to the summit. It has claimed the lives of many climbers, and as you'll soon see, it's not hard to understand why. The Abruzzi Spur rises sharply from K2's base and continues in an unforgiving 11,000 feet path up the mountain's southeast ridge. It's an unforgiving route that requires not only strength and stamina, but also incredible skill and nerves of steel. The route begins with House's Chimney, a nearly vertical 2,000-foot wall of rock and ice, named after American climber Bill House, who first climbed it in 1938. Climbers must haul themselves up using crampons and ice axes. This section alone is so difficult that only the fittest and most determined make it through. And that's just the beginning. After House's Chimney, things get even tougher. Next up is a section called the Black Pyramid, a maze of sharp, loose rocks sticking out at impossible angles, with ice patches that are slicker than glass. You have to watch every step and test every handhold. A single slip or loose rock, and game over. Most climbers find their nerves tested to the limits as they inch their way up, knowing a fall could mean tumbling thousands of feet to the base. But Alison didn't let any of this slow her down. She kept pushing forward, moving steadily up the mountain, her eyes fixed on the summit. But the weather was not on her side that summer. Storms battered the mountain day after day, forcing climbers to retreat repeatedly. One of her teammates, fellow Briton Alan Hinkies, managed to sneak an early weather window and climb to the summit before conditions worsened. But Alison wasn't in a rush. She was patient and cautious. She knew K2 was no ordinary mountain. By August 6th, Alison had climbed to Camp 3 twice and Camp 4 once. Each time she tried to go higher, the weather got worse. She had to stop her just above 26,000 feet. Most of her team decided to pack up and head home, but she and expedition leader Rob Slater decided to stay and make a further attempt. Most climbers left the base camp, but a few climbers from other teams also remained, all hoping for one last chance to reach the summit. On August 9th, they saw a brief window of good weather and decided to quickly take advantage of it. The plan was to go all the way up to the summit this time, but as soon as they reached Camp 3, they found disaster. An avalanche had wiped out their tents. On most mountains, that would be a sure sign that you'd made a mistake, set up camp in a bad spot. But this is K2. There are no safe spots. Avalanches can happen anywhere, anytime. Alison and the other climbers spent over an hour searching through the snow, trying to find buried gear. When they finally got what they needed, They pushed on to Camp 4, which they got to without incident on August 11th. Thankfully, Camp 4 was still standing. August 12th was a beautiful, clear day. It would have been perfect for a summit attempt, but they were too exhausted from the climb the day before. So, they chose to rest. The next day, August 13th at 2 a.m., Alison and 10 other climbers set off for the summit. From the start, the climb had problems. The snow was unstable, and the weather was looking sketchy. 5 climbers chose to turn back before reaching the Bottleneck Couloir. Bottleneck Couloir is a narrow and dangerous section where you have to climb under an enormous sérac that could collapse at any moment in unstable weather conditions. This is the part of K2 where you know you're really pushing your luck. One of the climbers who turned back was Peter Hillary, son of Everest legend Sir Edmund Hillary. He didn't like the look of the weather and decided it was time to retreat. But Alison kept going. She pushed on, driven by that same determination that had gotten her to the top of Everest. And at 6:17 p.m., she finally made it to the summit of K2. She stood at 28,251 feet above sea level, one of the highest points on Earth. She was one of the few women to have ever done so, and certainly one of the very few climbers to do it without supplemental oxygen. It was an extraordinary accomplishment, another triumph for a woman who had spent her life proving that anything was possible. She had no idea then, but a system of warm, moist air was coming up the valley from the south, and it was about to collide with a powerful anticyclone approaching from the northern Chinese side of the mountain. The storm had already hit Peter and other climbers at 5 p.m. They were descending nearby Broad Peak, about 2,000 feet lower than K2. Suddenly, he was fighting for his life against 80 to 100 mile-per-hour winds. As they rushed for shelter, they looked over at K2 in horror. They could still see figures on the mountain, still trying to reach the summit. It was Alison and other climbers, still going up, absolutely unaware of the devastation heading their way. By 6:17 p.m. after reaching the summit, Alison and the others began their descent. The weather was still clear at the summit, and they had no idea what was about to hit them. But as seasoned climbers, they knew they couldn't linger for long. They hadn't gone far when the storm rolled in fast. It was a massive wall of wind and snow hitting them out of nowhere. The temperatures dropped sharply, and within minutes, visibility was gone. It was chaos. Climbers were scattered trying to find a way down, but with no fixed ropes to attach themselves to and nowhere to take shelter, they didn't stand a chance. The mountain swallowed them up one by one as the wind picked them up and hurled them down the south face. Along with Alison, there were 3 Spaniards, a New Zealander, and an American. Days later, as the remaining 5 climbers descended past Camp 4, they stumbled upon a boot lying on a ledge. It belonged to Alison. They looked across and saw her body in her green climbing suit, lying thousands of feet below where she had fallen. They knew they should retrieve her, but they were exhausted and there was no way to carry her down. So they continued down, leaving one of Britain's greatest female mountaineers where she lay. Alison Hargreaves was 33 years old when she left behind 2 children who grew up knowing their mother was one of the bravest climbers in history. She came to K2 to make history, and she did. With the stories we've shared so far, you might have a guess why K2 is so dangerous, and it claims the lives of so many climbers, no matter how experienced they are. The first thing we can all agree on is the weather. K2 is well known for its extreme and unpredictable conditions, and it all has to do with geography. You see, K2 is located at the center of the Karakoram Range, which is one of the most geologically active areas in the world. Because the Karakoram Range is at the boundary between 2 colliding continents weather systems-wise. The winds can roar in from Central Asia, bringing freezing temperatures and blinding snow. Meanwhile, the summer monsoon from the Indian Ocean can push warm, moist air up the valleys, and this can cause heavy snowfall and dangerous ice conditions. This positioning makes K2 a magnet for sudden and violent storms. And unlike Everest, which is partially protected from violent weather by surrounding peaks, K2 stands almost alone, fully exposed. The mountain's sharp slopes bear the full brunt of the unstable weather systems, and this can cause very unpredictable weather conditions that can change in an instant. For example, in 2008, brutal weather conditions on the mountain led to a freak collapse of an ice sheet at 26,000 feet. This avalanche claimed the lives of 11 climbers in a single day and injured many others. And unfortunately, the instability of the terrain makes it almost impossible to predict when or where these incidents might happen. And there's the mountain's shape itself. K2 is known for its sharp, exposed slopes. Unlike many other high mountains, K2 has few gentle gradients or flat areas. The routes to the summit are extremely technical and require climbers to navigate around vertical ice walls and enormous overhanging seracs. One slip, one little mistake can send a climber flying down thousands of feet. Then there's the altitude. At 28,251 feet, K2 is the second highest mountain in the world. As I mentioned earlier, at this height, the oxygen level is about a third of what it is at sea level. This is the infamous death zone, where the human body cannot acclimatize to the lack of oxygen. Every breath becomes a struggle which leads the body to shut down slowly. It's a slow death the longer you stay up there with or without avalanches or weather changes. Climbers often experience severe altitude sickness, with symptoms like headaches, nausea, and fatigue. But it can get much worse. High-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE, fills the lungs with fluid, while high-altitude cerebral edema, HES, causes the brain to swell. Both can be fatal without immediate descent. And on K2, descending is often easier said than done. Unlike Everest, which sees hundreds of climbers each season, K2 is far less popular. The nearest village is days away, and the mountain is far from any major cities or hospitals. This isolation means that if something goes wrong, as they often do, rescue is not guaranteed. Even helicopters that can be dispatched face their own challenges, like the unpredictable weather and lack of clear landing sites. Climbers know that once they start their ascent, they are largely on their own. Lastly, K2's extreme cold and wind chill create a brutal environment. Frostbite is common, and the cold can make simple tasks like clipping a rope or pulling on a glove almost impossible. When the temperature drops and the wind picks up, it feels like the air itself is cutting through you. On K2, every decision you make is a life or death decision. What to wear, what gear to carry, and when to push forward or turn back. All these factors combine to make K2 a true test of human endurance, skill, and willpower. It's a mountain that does not forgive mistakes, a mountain where even the smallest error can be fatal, a place where nature's fury can overwhelm even the strongest climbers, leaving them at the mercy of the mountain. So knowing all this, how do you think expeditions to K2 could be made safer? Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.